When I was in high school, I was stopped in my tracks. I suddenly had a seizure while on a school trip in New York City. And it turned out, we found out later that day that it was caused by a brain tumor. So I had a brain tumor larger than a golf ball, my left temporal lobe, so above my left ear, and they needed to do emergency surgery on me. And so that experience, needless to say, was transformative in many ways. I do consider it to be the greatest gift of my life, but it was a challenge to go through that whole experience. And through that challenge, it transformed my thinking about health, where previously I had thought about health in a superficial way of wanting to be attractive and play sports well. And going through this, I realized that health is much more than that. It is about optimization of biology and living disease-free, and trying to, of course, live for as long of a healthy life as possible. And so at an early age, as a teenager, I started contemplating mortality and thinking about how I could live disease-free, whereas most people don't contemplate this until the later decades of their life, when maybe a loved one passes away or they get diagnosed with some sort of illness.
All right, you guys, welcome back to the Know Your Physio podcast. I'm here with Chris Mirabile from Novos. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yeah, why don't we start with why? Why don't you tell us why you do what you do, man?
Sure. So it's kind of a long story, but I'll give the short version.
Give us the long version.
Okay, I'll give you the long version. So it goes all the way back to when I was 12 years old. Be careful what you wish for. So when I was 12 years old, I started getting into exercise and health. The truth is, it was very much motivated by me just wanting to kind of stand out and be attractive to some of the girls I had crushes on in elementary school. And I started to exercise and do pull-ups and so on. But fast forward a few years, when I was in high school, I was stopped in my tracks. I suddenly had a seizure while on a school trip in New York City. And it turned out, we found out later that day, that it was caused by a brain tumor. So I had a brain tumor larger than a golf ball, my left temporal lobe, so above my left ear, and they needed to do emergency surgery on me. And so that experience, needless to say, was transformative in many ways. I do consider it to be the greatest gift of my life, but it was a challenge to go through that whole experience. And through that challenge, it transformed my thinking about health, where previously I had thought about health in a superficial way of wanting to be attractive and play sports well. And going through this, I realized that health is much more than that. It is about optimization of biology and living disease-free, and trying to, of course, live for as long of a healthy life as possible. And so at an early age, as a teenager, I started contemplating mortality and thinking about how I could live disease-free, whereas most people don't contemplate this until the later decades of their life, when maybe a loved one passes away or they get diagnosed with some sort of illness. So that's part of why it was a gift to me. That stayed with me. It was essentially a seed that began blossoming about a decade ago, but really blossomed fully 5 years ago when I started my company. So about a decade ago, I came across the scientific paper called The Hallmarks of Aging. It was published in a prestigious journal called Cell. And I came across the paper because I'm very much a science-driven person. I prefer to go straight to the scientific studies and the researchers to try to get as close to the source of truth as possible, rather than just listening to anecdote and so on. And so I came across this paper, and it really opened my eyes up to a number of things. First of all, I came to realize that the number one risk factor for chronic illness is aging. So that includes cancer, heart disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, glaucoma. I mean, you go down the list of all of these illnesses, the number one risk factor is simply getting older. Even more than cigarette smoke causes lung cancer, aging causes lung cancer by about threefold more than cigarette smoke does. So first of all, understanding that made me realize that if I want to avoid another brain tumor or any other illness for that matter, the best thing I could do is to try to put the brakes on aging. So then the question changed to, can you slow down aging? And that paper that I referenced identified the biological root causes for why we age, at least the ones that we knew of at the time, which at that time was 9 mechanisms of aging. Now we're up to 12 mechanisms of aging, and there will probably be more discoveries in the future. But the point is that we're deconstructing the aging process into its component parts and understanding why we get older. And then the question became, can we do things to counteract these mechanisms? And the short answer is yes. And so I founded a company that targets these mechanisms of aging with the goal of slowing down the aging process, which has been scientifically proven possible. And so we specialize in that as a company, whereas other health companies might specialize in, say, athletic performance or getting you the general essential nutrients like vitamin A and the B vitamins and so on. Novos, on the other hand, focuses on slowing down the aging process to maximize health span and lifespan.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing. And why don't we start by defining aging? How would you define aging at the cellular level? What is aging?
I would say that aging is it is essentially the combination of these mechanisms or biological processes that start to accumulate damage, disorder, chaos, or entropy within them, which then leads to less than ideal functioning. And as a result, when the cells and the constituent or component parts of these cells are unable to perform their function properly or communicate with each other properly, there's a breakdown in the system, and then it cascades up into tissue, into organs, and then into the whole body, where things like disease and less optimal biological processes results, and eventually death ensues.
And how consistent would you say that the protocols that you derive from these 12 hallmarks of aging, how consistent are they with the lifestyle that, let's say, folks in the blue zones maintain just naturally and intuitively?
Generally speaking, there is a lot of truth to be found in the blue zones. It's funny you mentioned the blue zones because I shared the stage with Dan Buettner just a few days ago in Switzerland, in St. Moritz, Switzerland, in which he discussed the blue zones and I discussed other aspects of aging and so on. I think that one perspective I disagree with Dan on as it relates to the blue zones is that the blue zones are the source of truth for everything related to aging. In other words, let's look at the historical lifestyles of these people living in blue zones and assume that this is the most optimal lifestyle we can possibly live. I think there are a lot of nuggets, golden nuggets of truth from the blue zones that we should integrate into our lifestyles, and we can talk about those. But at the same time, I think that it's not the full story, and there's a lot of things that scientific research is pointing to as additions or modifications we can make. An example of that is blue zones, depending on which blue zone, they're typically following more or less a Mediterranean-style diet. Icaria, Greece is the closest, the most conformant to a Mediterranean-style diet. Sardinia, Italy is kind of second closest, and then Okinawa, Japan, maybe third, and so on. But we at Novos created a modified version of the Mediterranean diet called the Novos longevity diet, which is perhaps 90% Mediterranean diet. But then we have 10% or so tweaks based on the latest research of ways that we believe we can further optimize that diet. So it's not to say we should throw out the historical blue zone traditions and so on, but we should look at them with a scientific perspective and questioning whether we can further optimize it.
Right, because and I imagine there's many reasons, but one of them could be that our modern environment is different for just about anybody, anywhere in the world, blue zone or not, and that's something that you have to fight against in some way, shape, or form. What are some other variables that you consider, in order to develop that 10% and keep yourselves at the cutting edge as we all age together?
Yeah, so first of all, you make a great point, which is that if you're living in Miami or New York, where I used to live, you're not living in a hilly, mountainous region of Sardinia, walking uphill, carrying your fruits and vegetables that you just picked yourself from the local garden, and drinking a bottle of fresh harvested or freshly stepped on wine or whatever you would consider it. You're not living that type of lifestyle, right? You're going out to a restaurant that has a bottle of wine that was corked in Sonoma County and has been sitting on the shelf for a few months, and you have a stressful life, with the traffic in New York City and so on, right? So what are the things that we can do to try to adapt these lifestyles, the modern American lifestyle, such that it can emulate many aspects of the blue zones, but perhaps even go further in certain ways? And so a key example of that is that Dan shared that he does not supplement with anything, even like a general multivitamin, nothing basic. And my philosophy on that is that supplementation can go a very long way for people. In theory, it could potentially even improve the lifespans of the already long-lived centenarians or blue zone residents. There are certain supplements, certain ingredients that are shown, for example, to stimulate different biological pathways that are associated with longevity, or even specific mechanisms of aging, as we're talking about, or even specific genes that we can trigger with specific substances. And whether that be something over the counter like pterostilbene and microdose lithium and calcium alpha ketoglutarate, or something prescription like rapamycin or metformin and so on. There are processes,
Nature's
berberine,
metformin.
exactly, yeah. And so to that point, in biological pathways, that berberine can increase AMP kinase, which is kind of like a cellular starvation signal. It's associated with longer, healthier lives, and it can downregulate to some degree mTOR, while also maintaining better blood glucose levels and lower LDL cholesterol. So overall, there's like a lot of potential benefits that can come from that. Now, whether it's been proven to extend human lifespan is another question, but I would not throw it out. Whereas there are some people who say there's no need for supplementation whatsoever. I would beg to differ on that.
Right. I mean, our environment is so different. And even something as simple as like exposure to EMFs. And I know that this is like a topic that is not the most established in the literature, but we know that to an extent, it can deplete magnesium. It can influence the activity of acetylcholine in the body. And then on top of that, our soil is simply, it's missing magnesium and other essential nutrients. So it's like, yeah, you can eat the foods that are rich in magnesium, but is that still going to cover, your bases? And that's just a basic example, right? So it's like we have to fight back against the modern environment that we live in, not just, what our body may or may not have on its own.
Yeah, so that's a great point. And it reminds me of, there was an analysis done by a American University of the NHANES data set, which is tens of thousands of people, their health outcomes, and it includes their food intake, their diet essentially. And it looked at nutrient, not just deficiencies, but inadequacies and insufficiencies. And it essentially found that the vast majority of people are deficient in vitamin D. It was almost 100% of people. Magnesium was, I think, in the upper 60s to lower 70s.
Which is required to activate vitamin D.
Right. Yep, yeah. That's true. Choline, for example, you mentioned acetylcholine, but choline, most people are not ingesting adequate levels of choline, which you can find in egg yolks, for example, and spinach. And so you go down the list and you see all of these things that people have insufficient intakes of. And just to be clear, a deficiency is defined essentially as not reaching the USDA guidelines for the necessary intake, such that it can cause some sort of acute illness like scurvy or something like that, right? From vitamin C deficiency. But
right, it's not a harmless little deficiency. It can actually cause an issue down the line if it's not, taken seriously.
in the short term, exactly, and that's a deficiency. But something that kind of escapes beneath the radar sometimes is getting an inadequate intake of these nutrients, and that means that you're just getting less than is ideal for optimal health outcomes. In other words, what they looked at, the researchers, was who are the longest lived members of these cohorts, how much of each of these nutrients are they taking in and
Mm,
versus everyone else, and what percentage of people are taking in these ideal levels. And when it comes to that ideal perspective, very few people were getting ideal levels. Now, if you look at the number of nutrients that people weren't getting ideal levels for, and then you just do the math and you consider what are the chances that I'm not getting ideal intakes for at least one, but most likely more than one of these nutrients, and it is practically 100%. It's like 99.999 repeating percent of people are missing or are getting inadequate intake of at least one thing: vitamin K, vitamin D, magnesium, choline, you name it. And so that's why I believe that it's in everyone's interest to at least have a solid basic multivitamin, for example, that includes vitamin D in it and magnesium, to be able to at least just cover your bases. But that would fly in contrast to perspectives of simply eating healthy.
right. Eating healthy, whole food just isn't enough in this modern day, in these modern environments, living these modern lifestyles, enduring the stress that we endure, period.
Exactly.
Unless you're in that subset of 0.01% that could be there by chance or because they are health obsessed. Basically, it's not your average Joe.
Exactly. And as healthy as I eat, and I live in Florida. My vitamin D levels decline. I need to supplement with vitamin D and vitamin K. I don't really get enough of it from my food. And, you know, fermented soy, the natto from Japan, which smells really terrible and most people don't want to eat it. Even if I wanted to, I can't find it anywhere here that has high levels of vitamin K. So in other words, it's difficult to get it naturally as healthy as I live. This is my industry, and I live it. And it's still hard to get adequate intakes.
And what kind of testing do you recommend for folks that want to see how they measure up against, these optimal standards?
Yeah, there's a number of different blood lab companies, and it depends on specific measurement that you're looking at. I would say that some are more important than others for you to look into. So particularly when it comes to the water soluble vitamins, my perspective on it is that
A, D, E, K?
because
No, those are fat soluble vitamins.
those
So
are
you're
fat,
talking about the
yeah. So
rest.
like
Well, the
C,
remainder, which is there's a ton.
yeah, well, so like vitamin C, all of the B vitamins are, let me think, those are predominantly the water soluble ones. So A, E, D, K are fat soluble, and then C and the Bs are water soluble. And then of course you've got your minerals like magnesium and
Yeah.
potassium and sodium that you're
Zinc,
sweating out
boron, magnesium,
constantly,
manganese.
peeing out,
Yeah.
exactly, which are water soluble. So my perspective is it is very hard to overdose on water soluble vitamins like vitamin C in the B family. There's one exception within the B family, but you still need super high levels to overdose on it. So I don't think you necessarily need to test for those. Just get a solid vitamin that contains greater than RDA levels of all of those nutrients and consume it with some food to slow down the absorption somewhat. Fat soluble vitamins you don't want to overdose on. You want to be a little bit more careful. But if you're getting, for example, with A, and debatable how much E you want to take, if any at all, but let's just, for simplicity's sake, say A and E, um, you want to get more or less right around the RDA level, maybe a little bit below if you're eating a healthy diet. And if you're over RDA, you're still within a safe territory. You just don't want to be like 10x, 20x the RDA. And then for something like vitamin D, I think you test for. You want
Hmm.
to check
Yeah.
what level you're at, and then that you can adjust whether you do 5,000 IU or 3,000, depending on season and your latitude. It might change, and your skin tone, it might change. Vitamin K should complement the vitamin D. You should take them together.
Hmm.
And the other thing I think people should test for, especially women, is iron. Get a full iron panel, including ferritin. Just
Hmm.
because your iron levels in your blood are high enough does not mean you have adequate iron levels. So ferritin, which stores the iron, you might have adequate iron in your blood, but then your ferritin levels are very low and you are essentially anemic. So you need a full panel on that. I have a personal quick story. I was donating blood a lot, and every time I donate blood, they do a quick test and they say, oh, yeah, your iron levels are ideal. You're fine. You can donate. Well, I started feeling very tired and fatigued and couldn't focus and so on. Some of my hair was falling out a little bit when I would shampoo my hair, and I couldn't figure it out. And doctors would never think like iron deficiency, right? Why would they? I'm a guy. Well, I was donating blood, and when I asked for that panel and I got it done, we came to realize I was borderline anemic from having very low ferritin levels. When I supplemented to get up to normal levels again, it's like, I could see in color again,
Yeah,
so I think iron is an important one, particularly for females or men if they donate blood.
for sure. And I want to share a little anecdote as well. I did a genetic test and I found that I have something called hereditary hemochromatosis. So I store too much iron. And on top of that, I have a gene for increased likelihood of Parkinson's, early onset Parkinson's. And on top of that, I was diagnosed with ADD when I was very, very young, and I was medicated for it. So my risk of early onset Parkinson's because of the ADD diagnosis and medication went up like 6 to 8x or more. But then if you look at iron and the way that we store iron in the basal ganglia, in the substantia nigra of the basal ganglia, where basically the onset of dopaminergic issues happens and you can get Parkinson's and, et cetera. I found that basically it was a terrible combo. If I were to get on this, optimal health kick and listen to all these, let's say, influencers online that are taking their beef organ supplements and eating all this raw red meat, I mean, in my case, it would be catastrophic. I would be seriously increasing my likelihood of early onset Parkinson's. So immediately I dropped red meat from like almost every day down to like once or twice a week, and my energy levels start to shoot up. So, it's not everything you see online is true. And it really takes taking this bio-individual approach and doing the necessary testing that can help you be specific about what the issue is. Because sometimes we have symptoms, which are signals, but they're not enough oftentimes to really get to the root cause and figure out what's going on and how we can fix it. So, I think the combination of our anecdotes should inspire anyone tuning in to take their testing very seriously.
Definitely. And when it comes to iron and the fact that you have high levels of iron as it relates to longevity, we published a article about this on our blog. It was written by a PhD researcher in the field. And essentially the point of the article is that there's a direct linear correlation with high iron levels with cancer. And so the higher the iron levels, the higher the risk of cancer. And it's something that for one reason or another is not really covered very much. But we cite the studies and everything in that article. And we also then come up with a recommendation of essentially you want to have like the lowest level of iron while still being above a certain threshold such that you don't have any some sort of symptoms of inadequate iron levels, which can include poor focus, hair issues, skin issues, bruising easily, poor athletic performance, getting winded easily. Even people having a desire to eat dirt is actually a symptom or sign of having inadequate iron levels. So there's a whole bunch of negatives that come from having too little. So you got to find that sweet spot and try to stay within that area.
How often do you recommend people get their blood work done? Specifically these more comprehensive panels to ensure that they're meeting that those optimal levels. Like you said, it's just above, right below. To measure up and maintain that sweet spot. How often should we be testing our levels?
I think ideally, and being just practically minded, ideally for most people, it should be twice a year, particularly between the distinct seasons, for example, like maybe winter to summer, depending on where you live, to be able to see, for example, if you live in a northern latitude and you're not getting that much sunlight, and maybe you only did during the summer when you're traveling or there's enough vitamin D production, and maybe now you need to test it going into the fall, winter transition period to see how much you need to supplement with. And then maybe you test again, like during that spring, summer period to see how much you might want to change your dosage to. I think that would be ideal for most people. At a bare minimum, I'd say once a year. And at a maximum. I mean, of course, you can test as frequently as you want, but I don't think there's much utility to testing more than once a quarter because it takes some time for changes and for you to absorb nutrients and so on and to see how that impacts. Even something like HbA1c, looking at your blood glucose levels, it's essentially your average blood glucose levels over the last 3 months. You need time to be able to see the impact that your
Right.
changes are making.
Right. And I'll raise my hand and say that if I were measured my markers that often, like once a quarter or more often, I'd probably end up micromanaging my health, and I don't think that's very healthy
Exactly.
either.
It's
So,
not.
yeah.
I agree. I think it's psychologically not healthy. I mean, I did have a
Yeah.
period when I was really getting into this field for this first time, like in my late 20s, early 30s, where I was becoming kind of OCD about it, like managing everything and tracking everything. And then you realize that it was good in the sense of me like learning a lot very quickly and like just diving in head first. But then you realize it's kind of taking away from quality of life and you need to kind
Yeah.
of like zoom back out. And now I test my blood labs like twice a year.
Yeah. Sweet, man. Sweet. Well, I want to shift gears and get back to these 12 hallmarks of aging. Would you mind taking us through what they are and how you guys are targeting each and every one of them?
Sure. So do you want me to just list them off first and then go through them, or do you want me to
Yeah, please.
describe what each one of them is and how we
Yeah,
target it?
let's list them off and go through them one by one.
Okay. All right. So there's a lot here, but all right. Let's start with mitochondrial dysfunction. So
Great
mitochondria.
place to start.
All right. So many of your audience might already be aware of it. You've probably mentioned mitochondria multiple times in your
I can't
podcast.
tell you
So
if I had a penny for every time I mentioned mitochondrial dysfunction. Oh man.
yeah, I could imagine. It's one of the more popular, well-known ones. So as we age, so these power plants of our cells, which convert the fats and the carbs that we consume into energy, into ATP, the energy currency of our cells, they become dysfunctional and we have fewer of them as we age. And so with our foundational formula at Novos, it's called Novos Core. We file for patents on this formula. It's the first formula in the world to address all 12 of the mechanisms of aging that we're going to describe now. The ingredients that specifically have evidence that they can positively impact mitochondrial dysfunction are malate, also known as malic acid. It's in like the skin of apples, glycine, the amino acid found in collagen, alpha ketoglutarate, specifically the calcium form, has been shown to extend lifespan in animal species. Fisetin, which is found in strawberries, it's also something that can help cope with senescent cells, which we'll talk about soon. Glucosamine sulfate, vitamin C, which can help potentiate the alpha ketoglutarate, and then pterostilbene, which is found in blueberries. It's kind of a cousin to the popular longevity ingredient. I put that in quotes because I don't believe in this ingredient, but it's resveratrol. I think there are a number of
we gotta
flaws with
talk
the
about that.
ingredient resveratrol.
Yeah.
Okay. So pterostilbene is like a cousin to that ingredient. It has a longer half-life and it has better oral bioavailability than resveratrol does. The second mechanism of aging that I'll go over is cellular senescence. So this is a process it's actually becoming increasingly popular in the wellness world. People are talking about it more. This is also known as like zombie cells. So these are cells that no longer perform their function. The body should, in theory, remove these cells, but for one reason or another, they're not removed. So cells can become senescent either because they get too old, they are cancerous cells that the body has arrested, but for some reason couldn't remove it through autophagy. Pregnancy and scarring, like you scrape your knee, like all of these events can lead to senescent cells. The issue with senescent cells is not only that they take up space and they're not performing function, but they also secrete inflammatory molecules known as a SASP, a senescent associated secretory phenotype. And these inflammatory cells, or molecules, I should say, cause nearby cells to become damaged and then increases the chances that they become senescent. And so senescent cells increase exponentially as we age. It's one of the reasons our skin wrinkles, for example. And so fisetin within our formula is studied to have a favorable effect on senescent cells. In fact, we did a study of our combined formula, and we compared it to rapamycin, and we looked at the effects that we could have on senescent cells, and we had essentially the same effect on senescent cells, that is reducing their size by about 50%, as the prescription drug, longevity drug, rapamycin did. So, yeah, we were really happy when we saw that, because
that's
we're
a big deal. I know
completely natural over
rapamycin
the counter.
is very experimental and I think borderline controversial in some circles. And it seems to me, and I could be biased here, but seems to me like this formula is a little more established in the literature versus rapamycin. I could be
Yeah.
wrong, but
Well, so the rapamycin is, just for your audience to understand, it is a drug that's typically prescribed for organ transplants, because when you take a large continuous dosage of it, it turns off your immune system and prevents organ rejection. But what's also been found is that if you take a large intermittent dosage, so like once a week or once every other week, every animal that has been studied with rapamycin has extended its lifespan, and including monkeys. And so there are a number of people, including scientists in the field, that personally take rapamycin with the hope that this can extend lifespan. It works by down-regulating mTOR, which we mentioned earlier. mTOR is a growth signal to our bodies, our cells to grow. Part of the reason why we age, and what we see through the evidence of mTOR, is that we are constantly in the growth state. And if you think about modern society, we're always eating. We have very high protein diets, a lot of carbs that stimulate insulin and so on, and mTOR as well. We're always in this growth state. And that's why things like fasting extend lifespan. It's because when you fast, you actually down-regulate mTOR, you up-regulate AMP kinase, which I mentioned earlier, which is the cellular starvation signal, but it has favorable effects, and we extend lifespan. So think of rapamycin as kind of like a fasting mimetic. It's something that mimics caloric restriction or fasting, and it turns on a bunch of those processes that you would otherwise need to go, a day or 2 or 3 without food. Rapamycin mimics some or many of those processes.
I
Now,
wonder how it
yep.
influences something like the intermittent metabolic switch and enabling a ketogenic state, because I know most of the benefits of fasting derive from that intermittent metabolic switch taking place. So I wonder if, with the influence that it has on AMP kinase activity, if it elicits this, and to what extent it elicits that versus fasting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know the answer to it. It does remind me, though, of like when I want to fast, I will intentionally shift my diet to a ketogenic diet. And it is so much easier for me to then go into that fast and go days
it's a
without
simulated
eating.
fast.
Yeah. Then if I go from like a diet replete with carbs and then try the fast, it's just that much more painful.
Yeah, for sure. There's a great paper by Cabo et al. 2019, published during the Journal of Medicine, that describes the intermittent metabolic switch, the influence that it has on longevity disease prevention. And they talk about these evolutionarily preserved mechanisms, and why fasting is, in a sense, like magic, right? We're really just getting in touch with the way that our body's designed, the way that we've been preserved through evolution. But the way that it describes this intermittent metabolic switch is beautiful. And they actually mention this like simulated fast. You don't have to actually cut out food. You just have to eat the foods that put you in a ketogenic state, and then add carbs back in strategically so that you can elicit the switch and therefore derive the benefits. If you haven't checked out that study, I'd recommend that you do. It's awesome.
Yeah, I haven't seen that study. I will check it out. And what this also reminds me of is a calorically restricted diet, similar to Walter Longo's work and the Prolon diet, which is actually a product line, and how you can actually mimic many of the beneficial effects of a fast without actually having to stop eating food. You can actually eat the food from this diet and satiate yourself, but it's
Mhm.
specific types of foods and calories that are going to then preserve many of the benefits.
Mhm. Lovely.
Okay, so moving on. So after cellular senescence is loss of proteostasis. So proteostasis is, you can kind of hear it in the word proteostasis, protein. And so proteins, they have to fold properly to be able to perform their function. And most people don't realize this, but proteins are like the backbone of biology. So if you think of your DNA, what is DNA for? It is for the sake of encoding protein, right? What are almost all prescription drugs are actually proteins. So proteins are what communicate within our body. They are like the messenger molecules within our body and tell our body how to function, what to do. And so if the proteins are not folding properly, then the signals are not being transmitted properly. You can also then have accumulation of these proteins inside of and outside of our cells, which then interfere with their proper functioning. And ingredients in Novos core that have been found to have favorable effects on proteostasis are lithium in the microdose form. So I just want to emphasize that. Technically, the scientific definition, we have a trace dose of lithium in our formula. It's 1 milligram. We evolved with lithium in our food supply and in our water supply. It leaches through the rocks into the water of streams and wells. And now with municipal water that's filtered and bottled water and eating farm-raised salmon and so on, we're not getting the lithium anymore. But studies have been done that find that people who have higher levels of lithium in their natural water supply, think San Pellegrino, that brand of bottled water has high levels of lithium. People who have higher levels have lower rates of Alzheimer's, dementia, suicide, depression, rape, murder, all of these brain-related issues, lower levels from small amounts of lithium, not the prescription doses, which are 100, 200 times higher, but these very small trace doses. So beyond lithium, glycine, glucosamine, and fisetin are all associated with improved proteostasis. The next mechanism of aging is altered intracellular communication. So our bodies are vast networks of cells, and these cells communicate with each other, and they do so with these proteins and enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that are able to communicate to each other and essentially tell the cells their state, what to do, and so on, send signals to each other. And so these cells are not as capable of doing so as we get older because there's higher levels of inflammation, which we'll talk about. Senescent cells, we've already talked about. Dysfunctional stem cells, which we will talk about, and so on. And substances like ginger, fisetin, and glucosamine have all been associated with improved intercellular communication. Next is genomic instability. So this is also known as DNA damage. And our DNA is constantly being damaged. I mean, you step outside, there's UV rays. That's damaging millions of DNA strands at any given moment in time. Our metabolic processes, eating food, for example, causes a lot of damage and DNA damage and so on. The positive is that we have machinery in our bodies to be able to repair that DNA. But as we get older, we don't repair it as well. And that's why, for example, rates of cancer increase as you get older. Most people have had cancerous cells in their bodies by the time they're reaching middle age, let's say. But our immune systems can detect those cancerous cells and remove them. Or if there's DNA damage to a cell that could turn cancerous, different molecules, for example, sirtuins, which are certain protein enzymes that can repair that DNA, go ahead and do that. But as we get older, we're not as good at this. And then those mutations to the DNA can start replicating and can then lead to cancerous growths, right? So genomic instability is it's one of the mechanisms of aging. And pterostilbene, which I mentioned earlier, glucosamine and magnesium have evidence that they can help to protect DNA. Epigenetic alterations. So this is a very exciting field of study. The epigenome is a layer that sits on top of your genes. It determines which genes are turned on or off. It's kind of like a dimmer switch for each gene. So in each cell, most of the DNA is muted. It's silenced because you only need a small segment of that DNA that relates to that specific cell and its function, right? Like you don't need access to the heart cell functions for your hair follicle, right? So most of the DNA is actually kind of wrapped up in a spindle and it's not accessible. But the epigenome is through a process known as methylation, will actually expose that segment of the DNA, make it accessible so that the transcriptome can then transcribe that DNA and then create proteins, and then those proteins then lead to the functions and so on and so forth. So the epigenome, as we age, it kind of falls into disarray. So if you think of your genes as like a piano, then your epigenome is which keys are being played. And when you're young, it plays a beautiful song like Tchaikovsky, let's say. And then when you get older, you start missing some keys, or you press the wrong key, or you hit a key too hard or too soft, and it just doesn't sound as good anymore. Yeah, right, exactly. So there are different things that can help with the epigenome and its alterations, from lithium to glycine, alpha-ketoglutarate, vitamin C, ginger, and pterostilbene, all in the Novos core formula. There's also a lot of exciting stuff we could talk about another time related to epigenetic reprogramming and actually proving that we can make an old organ young again, which is something that's very promising and is being done at Stanford and Harvard and so on. Next is telomere shortening. So our telomeres are the end caps of our chromosomes, and our chromosomes are what contain our DNA. And you can think of it as almost like the end of a shoelace, right? So if you didn't have that end to the shoelace, then the laces would fray and you'd see all of the threads. Imagine those threads are your DNA. So that end cap to the shoelace is your telomere for your chromosomes protecting your DNA.
What a great analogy, man.
Oh, thank you.
That's incredible. That's really good. I've never heard that before. That's really great.
Thank you. Yeah, so it simplifies it, right? And so imagine if like every single time you had a cellular division, that end cap was getting a little bit shorter. Eventually it gets so short that like the DNA is no longer protected and you have the frays of the DNA threads. And then this is associated with gastrointestinal cancer and other diseases, and then ultimately shorter lifespans. Like if your telomeres are beyond a certain threshold, which is known as the telomeric brink, in other words, they don't get too short, then it doesn't really matter whether you have long telomeres or mid-sized telomeres. It's that you've got enough telomeres. But if your telomeres get too short, you reach that telomeric brink, and then disease increases and life expectancy is shorter and so on. So
each individual shoelace comes undone.
Yeah, basically. So lithium, magnesium, and pterostilbene are ingredients associated with preventing the shortening of the telomeres. Number 8 is deregulated nutrient sensing. So there are different nutrients signals. So that includes mTOR and AMP kinase, like we talked about before. And it signals to the cells how they should be producing energy, how much energy they should produce, so on and so forth. And this gets disrupted as we age. And it has metabolic effects on us and energy production and so on. And so fisetin and pterostilbene are shown to be able to help protect the nutrient sensing of the cells. Number 9 is stem cell exhaustion. So we all should have learned in high school biology class the idea of stem cells. They are essentially the cell that creates the duplicates of our cells. So we're constantly creating copies of our cells because they're dying off, they get damaged, and so on. And stem cells are the cells that create those copies. But as we age, those stem cells age as well. In fact, the cells can only replicate so many times before they hit something known as the Hayflick limit, which is the number of cellular divisions before it's no longer possible to divide anymore. And so one thing that should tell us is that we want to try to avoid having to replace cells in the first place. How do we avoid having to replace cells? Well, we prevent damage to our cells, undue damage. We want a little bit of hormetic stressors in our lives, but we don't want excessive stressors and damage. And that can come from inflammatory foods, excess inflammation, even from excess exercise, like doing multiple marathons in a week is probably not good for you. Excess alcohol consumption, smoking cigarettes, breathing pollution, all this stuff leads to inflammation, damage, and essentially the need to replace cells. And we don't want to have to do that. Now, that's also going to shorten telomeres. So you might be noticing a lot of these are kind of interconnected with each other. In fact, all of them in one way or another can impact the other ones, either directly or indirectly. And so glycine and alpha-ketoglutarate can help protect the stem cells. Inflammaging is number 10. So this is a play on words. It's inflammation and aging combined. And inflammaging is this idea of this chronic low-grade inflammation that starts as a whisper, turns into a hum, and then eventually as you get older is this very loud, obnoxious, omnipresent inflammatory signal in our bodies. And there are different ingredients, many different ingredients in the Novos core formula that can address inflammaging, everything from glycine to fisetin, pterostilbene, ginger, lithium, magnesium, alpha-ketoglutarate, rhodiola rosea, and in a separate product of ours, Novos Boost, an ingredient called NMN can also help with inflammaging, as well as mitochondrial health, which we mentioned earlier. Number 11 is disabled autophagy. So autophagy is this process in which our bodies basically cannibalize cells. So it will identify a cell that's not functioning properly, it's getting old, and it will go and it will eat that cell and recycle its parts. It's getting rid of the old cells, the cells that are not performing their functions well and can cause a problem. It's going to identify that and then recycle its parts. But as we get older, we're not as good at doing that. And if we're not as good at doing that, then it makes sense that maybe the cell turns senescent. And that's part of the reason why there's more and more senescence. And when there's more senescence, there's more inflammatory molecules, which lead to more inflammaging. So you see how these are connecting with each other and leading to all of them kind of accelerating this process and leading to that exponential curve. So lithium, glucosamine, acetylglucosamine, which is found within hyaluronic acid, can actually have a favorable effect on the unfolded protein response. Fisetin, pterostilbene, and glycine can act as a chaperone, which protects proteins from damage and then reduces the need for the autophagy. All of these are in Novos core. And then finally, the last one, this took a while, but the 12th one is dysbiosis. This is microbiome dysbiosis. So we're all by now familiar with our microbiomes. They change dramatically as we age. They become less diverse. There are certain species that are reduced as well that are particularly important for health. And our guts have multiple organ axes, our gut-brain axis, our gut-liver axis, our gut-heart axis, our gut-skin axis. So our guts really do have an impact on many critical organs. And ingredients like ginger, pterostilbene, fisetin, rhodiola, and lithium all have evidence to have potentially favorable effects on the microbiome. So
lovely. Well, thank you for taking us through all 12. I have a series of questions for you. I really want to, dial in on some of these topics. So let's start with the synergistic influence of some of these ingredients. How can these work together? I understand independently how they can work to elicit a combined effect, but have you guys studied these working synergistically? Are there any ingredients that don't work together well? Have you looked into that? Can any ingredients counteract each other to an extent? What is the proof that these ingredients work together the way that they can and should independently when they're in this formula?
It's a fantastic question. It's one that we contemplated when we were first coming up with the formulation, but then we went on to also do scientific tests to prove it out. So what you're describing in the worst case would be something known as a dysergy, which is the opposite of a synergy. In other words, the ingredients combined don't only neutralize each other, but they actually lead to a negative health outcome. And that is the worst thing. And there are actually reasons to be concerned about products out there that might actually have dysergy effects. And so when we were formulating it, we were first of all looking at the different mechanisms that the ingredients would be addressing and then different biological processes that we were aware of. Now, it's impossible for us to claim that we're aware of every single thing that every single ingredient does to the human body. And that might even differ across people to some degree or another. So we couldn't go that far. But what we could do is look at all of the known research for these different ingredients and the ways that they function and what they impact, and then make a very informed analysis of that and determine which ingredients to include and not to include. So an example would be the concept of hormesis. So hormesis is when you put a certain amount of stress on our physiology such that we come back stronger. So a simple example of this is exercise. If you can only lift 10-pound weights 10 times, and then you try again next week, maybe you can lift 11 pounds 10 times or 10 pounds 11 times. You got a little bit stronger because your body sensed the stress and said, I don't want to be damaged as much. The muscle fibers don't want to be damaged as much next time. Let me get stronger to be able to cope with that. The issue with hormesis is that you can overwhelm the system. If you have excess stressors, imagine you can only lift 10 pounds, but you try to lift with all your might 100 pounds. You might tear a muscle. That's not a good thing, right? So the same thing holds true for these molecules that we're ingesting. And you can have hormetic molecules like pterostilbene from blueberries has a hormetic effect. If we combine that with other hormetic ingredients, we might actually end up having a toxicity. So we were very mindful of the hormetic ingredients that we were using and making sure that we don't overdo the hormetic approach to aging. And we thought through other mechanisms and biological pathways in a similar way. Now, how do we know whether it's working or not? Well, we've done different scientific studies that have shown synergistic effects. So, for example, we did a study at the Salk Institute, a prestigious biological research center in California. And we looked at a process known as oxytocin ferroptosis. And this is associated with Alzheimer's and cancer development. And they are doing a study of a prescription drug that is not yet available for sale that is targeting specifically oxytocin ferroptosis. And then they compared our formula and our individual ingredients to that prescription drug. And they found that the single ingredient in our formula to favorably impact oxytocin ferroptosis most powerfully is fisetin. But then they looked at our combined formula, and they found that our combined formula was 50% as effective between the fisetin and the prescription drug. So that is significantly more effective than fisetin on its own. And so that is an example of a synergistic property of our formula that we can more effectively target oxytocin ferroptosis than the individual most effective substance being the fisetin. We've done similar studies with DNA damage, and we found that, for example, the very first study we ran as a company was at a CRO that did $7 million worth of studies on DNA oxidative damage from irradiation. So imagine oxidative damage is kind of like a rust on a car. So imagine rust on DNA, so to speak, coming from ultraviolet rays, irradiation. And they had studied every single one of our ingredients in our formula and found no significant effects. And they actually tried to persuade us not to run the study because they're like, you're not going to find anything. And we said, listen, it's our very first study. It's affordable. Let's just run the study and take a look and see what happens. So we ran it. And they were amazed. The researchers in the lab called their CEO first before even calling us because they couldn't believe the results. And then they ran it again. They checked it. Everything checked out. They found that our combined formula reduced oxidative damage by 77%, which is off the charts beyond even prescription drugs that they had tested. So again, it's in vitro. It's not like in a human body. It's human cells. But so, we can only go so far with the conclusion from that one single study. But to see something like that shows that there's something special about the combination and the synergistic effects that we're witnessing from it. We've gone on to do more advanced studies since then. We, in fact, did a mouse study that we'll be publishing the preprints in about 2 weeks from now, where we showed more significant lifespan extension than any other over-the-counter natural product ever studied in mice in terms of percentage lifespan extension in healthy mice. We don't know of any other natural substance that has performed as well as our product has. So we're showing it also in living mammalian species that we're extending the lifespan. We're even showing in humans with epigenetic tests, which can measure how fast or slow you're aging, that we're slowing down people's rate of aging as well, according to that measure. So there's a number of different ways that we're collecting this evidence. But I hope that answers the question in terms of how we're confident that there's a synergistic property to the formula.
Absolutely does. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing, and congratulations on the incredible outcomes on these studies. That's really something to be proud of.
Thank you. Yeah, it's great. As a company, I wanted to create one that leveraged the best aspects of biotech and the best aspects of over-the-counter natural products and merge them into a new category of its own. I feel like there's this huge divide between the supplement world and the biotech world, and there's a lot of room to have very high-end, well-researched, proven to be efficacious and safe combinations of natural ingredients. And in this world where we need more and more to be proactive with our health and prevent disease and to live as healthy as we can rather than following the sick care model that unfortunately modern medicine has turned into, it becomes increasingly important for us to start to prove out that we can have these positive effects with natural ingredients and not just trust what people say, but prove it with science.
Yeah, and I admire that a lot because I hear you, and I think that there is a lot of room for innovation. I think that there is a category between those two areas that needs to be taken seriously, and that we can measure, whose efficacy we can measure. Otherwise, it's sexy, but it's goes over people's heads. It just doesn't do what it promises to do. So I really admire the testing and how diligent you guys have been with the testing since the inception of your company. I have a few questions about, the influence that lifestyle strategies and habits can have on the overall efficacy. How much better can your formula work if it's combined with a healthy lifestyle change?
It's a good question.
It's a loaded question.
It is. I don't have a perfect answer for you, but I'll think through it out loud and I'll share with you why I don't have a perfect answer. If the question were rephrased to what is the most effective way to address aging and essentially slow down the process and lead to the longest, healthiest life possible, the answer would be the combination of my formula with incredibly important aspects of life like diet, even meal timing and the number of calories that you're consuming, activity, the types of activity, the intensity of it, the frequency, and so on, sleep, stress management and psychology, human relationships and community, sense of purpose. All of these things combined are shown to be either directly causal or at least highly correlated with longer, healthier lifespans. But if the question is it better to take the supplement if you're following this super healthy lifestyle or if you're not? I don't know. And the reason is that, like, imagine somebody who is not eating the healthiest diet and they're not living like the most ideal lifestyle. And maybe they're aging at a rate of like 1.2. To just simplify it, they're aging 20% faster than the average person.
Right.
To improve that from 20% faster to only 10% faster, maybe, I'm just saying theoretically, maybe my formula can improve it by 10%. Now, if you take someone who's living a super healthy life and they're not yet taking my product and they're aging at 0.8, 20% slower than the average person, and they take my product, it might be harder to get them from 0.8 to 0.7, that 10% change. Maybe it goes from 0.8 to 0.75. Maybe it's a 5% improvement in that case, right? Because they're already tapping into a lot of the different, like they're getting very healthy foods and nutrients and so on. And so maybe it's less significant of an impact.
Mm-hmm.
That's theoretical. I don't know. Ultimately, my perspective on it is that people who are living very healthy lifestyles, and people probably like yourself and definitely myself, I want to do everything I can to optimize my health and to maximize my health span and lifespan. So I'm going to do everything on the checklist. That includes stress management, sleep, diet, activity, and supplementation. Then you take someone at the opposite extreme who's living a very unhealthy life and they're smoking cigarettes and they're not wearing any sun protection and they are laying on their couch all day long eating inflammatory foods and so on. Well, maybe they can benefit from a formula that can protect the DNA more so than somebody who's already protecting their DNA. You get what I'm saying? Why it's complex.
Absolutely.
And I don't have a direct answer.
No, and this is an incredible answer. I think it really covers covers all the bases for us. Something that I wonder, for example, if I can be more specific with lifestyle strategies is, you describe some of the ingredients as having a hormetic effect. I'm curious how much better the formula can work if you measure your HRV, for example, take it when you're in a more parasympathetic state, higher HRV, to derive as much benefit from the hormetic stressor as possible, versus taking this when you're stressed out. Obviously there's so many layers of questions that we can come up with just, with this topic in mind, but I'm curious how you can given the hormetic effect of some of these ingredients, how much the state of your nervous system can help you derive certain benefits.
My initial response to that would be there are multiple ingredients within the Novos core formula that can actually improve calmness. And, if you happen to be, as you mentioned, stressed, it could, in theory, potentially improve that or reduce those stress levels and induce calmness. So, for example, the microdose lithium, which we've spoken about already, L-theanine is in the formula, which is found in green tea. Yep. But that can
glycine as well, which is GABAergic.
Glycine also, and rhodiola rosea and adaptogen.
Yep.
So all four of those ingredients can potentially help if you happen to be in that state. So, I don't have a definitive answer, but I mean that's where I would start, is to consider that maybe it actually ends up helping people who are in that stressed state.
For sure. And I know we only have a few minutes left here, so I wanted to ask you a couple final questions before we sign off. What do you foresee as, the future of Novos? I mean, what would you like to see within the next 5 to 10 years, both in your company and in the population that you're seeking to help, whether that's a specific target that you have in mind or, worldwide? What kind of impact do you want to have, and what kind of direction do you foresee for the company?
Great question. So a few thoughts come to mind. First is that we were just this month, or actually 1 month ago in August, we were accepted into the Longevity Biotech Association. We are the only over-the-counter natural product company in that association. Everything else is traditional biotech as you would think about it, like inventing new molecules like the pharmaceutical route, or CRISPR DNA modification. I mean, we're talking about hardcore biotech, and we were accepted into it because of our quality standards, the scientific approach we take, the clinical studies that we've initiated, and so on. So
That's
I see
incredible.
Novos as, thank you. It's something I'm personally very proud of, and it's something I've wanted to achieve for a while. Is even though we sell over the counter products and consumers might think of us as a supplement company, at our core, we're truly a biotech company that happens to be working with natural molecules. There's nothing inadequate about natural molecules. The problem that many companies see is that it's hard to get IP protection, patents on natural molecules. And
Yep.
so that's why pharma companies will take a very powerful molecule and modify it so that they own the IP of that modified molecule, then turn it into a prescription drug. It doesn't mean it's better for you, right?
Unbelievable that they can do that to the natural world, and just
Yeah.
screw us, man.
Yeah. Yeah. So I still want to use the natural molecules, and we found ways to be able to patent combinations and so on. It's not as strong of IP protection as a pharma would have, but nonetheless, we're succeeding in the approach that we're taking, and I hope that it's a model for other companies. In terms of where I hope to see us in 5 to 10 years, well, first of all, I'd like for Novos to turn into an institution for longevity for consumers, like direct to consumers, and giving them the knowledge and information and resources that they need to be able to take their health span and lifespan into their own hands. To that point, our vision at Novos is to add 1 billion years of healthy life to humanity. And we're not going to do that simply by selling our formulas. We're going to do that by educating people about lifestyles that they can live, which might even cost them less money. For example, if you fast, you're not buying food, you're actually saving money, right? So it's not about these inaccessible approaches for the rich to like transfuse blood or to spend $2 million a year to try to achieve, these different results. It's about making things very accessible. And so to that point, my mission is to make longevity as accessible and achievable to the masses as humanly possible. And so that includes people around the world, regardless of education, income levels, and so on. We're trying to make this as accessible as possible. We launched a mobile app that's completely free to hopefully do that. And that's just the beginning for us.
That's absolutely incredible. That's absolutely incredible. And I'm happy to be a part of this mission with you, just, hosting you on the show, having this conversation, and introducing this topic, this way of thinking, and this biotechnology to more people all around the world. We have an audience of very curious citizen scientists that are always seeking to get their hands on the absolute best. And I really admire both how noble your mission is, and also simultaneously how efficacious the underlying science is to bring this mission forward. So I really can't thank you enough for the hard work that you're doing, and you absolutely should feel extremely proud for how far you guys have come and how far you'll continue to go. I have one more question for you
Thank
before
you.
we sign off. Yeah, my pleasure. If you could put a word, message, or phrase on a billboard somewhere in the world, what would it say, and where would you put it?
Wow. I don't know. That's a tough one. I mean, I think if I had more time to think about this, it would actually be more wise and philosophical. But just because my mind is in that box of longevity that we've been talking about lately, I think maybe it would be something like, something like essentially like you can slow down your aging, or something to that effect. Like you can slow down your aging, here's how, and then there's like a QR code or something, and it brings them to the resource that they need. And where would I
Nice.
put it? Um, that's a tough one. That's a tough one. Um, it would have to be somewhere very highly trafficked. I mean, you naturally think something like Times Square, with all of the eyeballs that are there, or maybe China has something, even bigger. I don't know. I don't know exactly where, but some very highly trafficked big city where you're going to get a lot of eyeballs and impact as many people as possible.
I love it, man. I love it. Anything else you want to share with our viewers before you sign off?
Sure. Very quickly, I have a personal blog called slowmyage.com is the website. I'm also on Instagram and on X, and to a lesser degree on TikTok as Slow My Age. It'd be great if you followed. Then Novos is novoslabs.com. We're also on all of the social networks as Novos Labs. And then finally, we didn't get to really go into it, but check out our free mobile app, which includes a free biological age test that's more accurate than the first generation of blood-based epigenetic tests like the Horvath clock. It's survey-based, created by a brilliant scientist, mathematician at University of Washington. Her name is Dr. Sue-In Lee, and we imported her work into the app. So that's free. We also provide personalized lifestyle guidance to slow down your aging. And we have an LLM built in. So think of something like ChatGPT, but it's trained on your survey responses, soon your wearable data, and longevity database that we provided to it to be able to give you very personalized coaching and guidance for longevity. Again, all 100% free, and that's called Novos Life, iOS and Android.
Thank you so much for sharing. I'll make sure to put this in our show notes at the very top. Folks who tune in and start getting some value immediately, slow their age. Thank you so much, Chris. What an honor and pleasure, man.
Thank you. Thank you. It was a pleasure to be here. Nice to meet you too.
Likewise.